They're here.
You don't understand. I could have had class. I could have been a contender.
Hulk, smash.
Mrs. Robinson, you're trying to seduce me.
Here's Johnny.
What do you want?
Yippee-ki-yay, motherfucker.
You never go ass to mouth.
Now what is so damn funny?
And here we go.
We will not go quietly into the night. We will not vanish without a fight.
The Force will be with you. Always.
But the truth! You can't handle the truth! Showtime, everybody! Showtime!
Hey everybody, welcome to another edition of the For Real Movie Club. I am your host, Chris the Dace Man Dace, and joining me on tonight's panel, the one and only Tony Mango.
Woo, it's me.
And the other one and only, which kind of makes them all twos, Mike Paden.
Well, I'm definitely not number two. Tony's two.
Oh.
Just ask Trish.
I thought it was Steve.
Who's Steve?
Number two.
I'm Steve. You're Steve? We're all Steve. And on tonight's
One and only Steve.
one and only Steve, we'll be talking about Thanksgiving-themed movies, hat tip to Sam Lassio. The first movie we'll be talking about is Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, which is a 1987 American comedy film written, produced, and directed by John Hughes. The film stars Steve Martin as Neil Page, a high-strung marketing executive who meets Del Griffith, who's portrayed by John Candy, an internally optimistic, overly talkative, and clumsy shower curtain ring salesman who seems to live in a world governed by a different set of rules. They share a 3-day odyssey of misadventures trying to get Neil home to Chicago from New York City in time for the Thanksgiving dinner with his family. Tony, what are your initial thoughts on Planes, Trains, and Automobiles?
I was a little bit disappointed. I've heard this movie talked about for, years and years now as like a classic. And I went into it expecting it to be something that I would really laugh my ass off in. And really, I was kind of just disappointed in the majority of the jokes and stuff. It seemed a little half-assed to me. I get why it's popular, because if it was released around the right time, it could have caught a lot of wind, but it's not something that I could see myself watching every Thanksgiving like a lot of people do. And that's kind of disappointing in itself that it's disappointing.
Mr. Paden, what are your initial thoughts on Planes, Trains, and Automobiles?
I think it's one of the greatest comedies of all fucking time. Fuck Tony, he's wrong. All right, I remember seeing this long ago as one of the regular Comedy Central picks of their movies that they played, and I loved it. I'm a huge Steve Martin fan. I'm a huge John Candy fan, and to have these two together as like a buddy traveling comedy is just fantastic. Like, a excellent example of slapstick and the comedy of the time.
For when it comes to this film, it's directed by John Hughes, who has been widely considered a teen angst filmmaker if you look at his run of films. With this being kind of his first venture into comedy using Steve Martin and John Candy, do you think he did well as a director moving into this, director and writer into this type of project? We'll start with you, Mike.
I honestly do not give John Hughes any credit for this. I don't even think the jokes are particularly well written. It's the delivery. Everything is all about the delivery, specifically Steve Martin. Steve Martin's facial expressions, the way he can just show emotion as he's delivering his lines is just fantastic. So, no, I don't give John Hughes any credit for that.
Tony, what are your thoughts on John Hughes' venture into this type of movie release?
See, what you just said there, Paden, is exactly why I'm disappointed in the movie, sort of. The two main actors in this are perfect for their roles and stuff, but it's kind of a situation of you get two good actors in a bad script and they make it tolerable, instead of if you would have had two horrible actors in the same movie, I don't think this would be popular at all. I don't think that the movie is good. I think that the principal actors are good. And John Hughes, I agree with you. He doesn't really deserve much credit to this at all.
So you guys have touched a little bit on the casting in this. Steve Martin and John Candy are obviously the lead roles. Some of the other minor roles that are in there: Michael McKean is a state trooper. Kevin Bacon is a taxi racer. Matthew Lawrence is Neil Page Jr. thought that said Martin, so now I really don't care as much.
Yeah, I was gonna say I don't remember Martin Lawrence in this.
And Ben Stein was at the Wichita airport representative. So
Yes.
when it comes to casting for this film overall, we'll start with you, Tony. How do you feel? Do you feel that Steve Martin, John Candy were perfect for this, or could two other people have filled this role?
Definitely perfect for it. Definitely typecast too, but that's not a bad thing. People get typecast for sometimes a good reason because they're so good at pulling it off. Like John Candy is perpetually nice and apologetic all the time in like every fucking movie that he's in. So if I was supposed to have somebody who's like bothersome and too optimistic and it gets on my nerves, but I know that they're deep down a good person and I grow to love the guy, John Candy's like one of my go-to examples for that. And Steve Martin is a perfect example of somebody who is a real asshole, but he learns the better of his ways and whatever. He's done that in a bunch of different movies. And come on, if you're going to cast somebody as somebody looking for a cab, you got to go with Kevin Bacon.
Paden, what was your thoughts on the casting for this film?
Absolutely perfect. Tony really nailed all the points. John Candy is a guy who is nice to the point where it actually gets kind of annoying. So perfect select of the role. And I actually think it's kind of funny that you talk about him repeating this role. I'm pretty sure John Candy played this exact same role in Home Alone 2.
Yeah.
Yeah, he did.
A guy trying to get home for the holidays, teams up with somebody to help him get there.
If you were to tell me, like the subreddit fan theories where people try to connect things that aren't actually in the movies themselves and stuff, if you were to try to convince me that it is the same guy and he's playing Del Griffith in that, I could believe it.
Mm-hmm.
Like he stopped being a shower curtain salesman and he started
started
getting into polka.
Yeah.
Yeah, like I would believe that 100%.
So just to give everybody a few facts about the movie before we move into our next set of questions. It was directed, produced, written by John Hughes, and of course starring Steve Martin and John Candy. The music was Ira Newborn, and the cinematography was done by Donald Peterman, edited by Paul Hirsch, and the production company was Hughes Entertainment. It was distributed by Paramount Pictures and was released November 25th, 1987 with a runtime of 92 minutes. And the box office, it grossed about $50 million. One other thing that comes with the movies that we like to talk about here is our favorite scenes and what our least favorite scenes. So, Tony, we'll start with you. What was your favorite moment within this movie?
Easily, it has to be when they're sharing the hotel room and they wake up realizing that they've cuddled each other, and their reaction to that is so perfect for two guys that don't want to admit that it was like anything that we did. He's like, you see the Bears game last week? Hell of a game. They're gonna go all the way. I love the fucking back and forth between them, especially that dialogue itself. If they didn't think of that and somebody like John Hughes wrote it, I'll give them credit for it, because the succinctness to it of, you see the Bears game last week? Yeah, hell of a game, gonna go all the way. Just spitting out like, the quarter pass, it's really the offense is great this year. It's like, everybody has heard the same conversation happen from people that are in small talk situations and stuff, and that's a perfect representation of what most guys would do in that scenario. I laughed hysterically at that part, and I actually rewound it and rewatched it again, like right after that had happened, just because I was like, man, that's so fucking perfect.
And what was your least favorite moment, or something that you said, that's just not interesting?
It shouldn't be, because this is not their intention at all. I'm 100% sure of that, but it's at the very end when Steve Martin is sitting in the train on the way home, and he's smiling and thinking about his family, and he kind of comes to the realization of what John Candy's character is actually doing here. It felt awkward to me. It was just a bad directorial choice, I think, because the shots of him silently laughing and he's thinking about his family, and we don't get to know this family like at all. It's almost like post-mortem or something.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know, it's supposed to be like heartwarming and sad and whatever, but it was just cringeworthy to me instead. So the biggest moment of the film that's supposed to be like a hook for me is the thing that cancels me out the most.
Peyton, what was your favorite movie moment when it came to this movie?
What's your favorite movie?
Yeah.
Well, my favorite movie is Jurassic Park, and my favorite part of this movie is when Steve Martin is at his Steve Martinest, and that is right after he gets to the airport car rental place.
Yes.
And they send him to get his car, but it's not there. So he has to trek all the way back to the terminal, and he's just going through all this crap, sliding down a hill. He loses his hat. There's just all these problems going on. Finally, he gets to the desk, and you could just see like the expression in his face. He's been saving it all for this moment, and this cheery-eyed, smiling freaking prick of a woman just trying to kill him with kindness, but he's not going to have it, and he just lays into her. And after he releases all of his emotion, what does the woman have to say to him but, well, you're fucked.
What was your least favorite moment when it came to this movie, if there is one?
That's a really tough thing to say. I mean, Tony's right. Whenever they try to do the emotional parts of the movie, I really don't think they hit that, and that's because that's not Steve Martin and John Candy's strong suit. And that was the moment where we really needed to rely on the director and the cinematographer and the music arrangements. And a lot of them really just didn't come together during those parts. I know there was another part where John Candy gets kicked out of the hotel room, or like he's not allowed into it because he couldn't afford it. So Steve Martin's character just took it himself, and he's sitting in the car by himself, and he's trying to apologize to his dead wife, like, oh, I did it again, I'm a big dummy. And it's just like, this was supposed to be a really heartwarming scene, but it just came across really awkward.
Mm-hmm. One thing you did touch base on a little bit there is the music score and the soundtrack for the movie. Tony, when it comes to the soundtrack, the score was done by Ira Newborn, and there's a few other songs in there, such as the Red River Rock, which was performed by the British group Silicon Teens, because they're so popular.
Woo, Silicon Teens!
What were your
They are.
What were your thoughts on the score for this movie?
Well, it's been a little while since I watched this and prepped for our podcast, and I don't remember too many specifics about the music, but looking at my notes now, the very first thing that I have written down is, and even before the Kevin Bacon scene, is the music is so of its time.
Mm-hmm.
Which, if I'm remembering correctly at why I wrote that note down, it's the music that plays when he's trying to find the cab, and it's hardcore 80s. Which is not necessarily a bad thing to an extent. I mean, if you are watching a movie like this for nostalgic purposes, that's perfect. But at the time, it was probably amazing, and now it's like laughable. The music plays a part into why that one scene is one of my least favorites, because it is a little bit too hokey, and throughout the whole thing, there's no like real positives that I can think of when it comes to the music, other than the fact that if you are looking at it in the nostalgic way, that, you know, it's good for that. But it kind of suffers from the same thing that a lot of 80s movies do, where it's so over the top and it's so like the kind of shit, like where you're just like, wow, I get it, this is a comedy. But you know, it could be worse. So
Peyton, what were your thoughts on the musical score and soundtrack for this film?
Well, there's two of them specifically that stick out, and one of them is, like Tony said, a very excellent example of 80s music at the time. And again, I'm referencing the scene where Steve Martin is looking at his car and he's walking back and he's going through all the problems as he's going through it. And while he's going through that, it's playing one of those like kind of 80s like songs. It reminds me of that one song from Ferris Bueller that's like, oh yeah, bow bow. It reminded me of that, only instead of doing like, oh yeah, it had sound clips of Steve Martin like yelling. It was like, you're messing with the wrong guy.
That was awkward as fuck, wasn't that?
But my favorite musical part in the movie is when both of the characters are driving around in their Woody wagon, and Steve Martin's taking a little nap. John Candy's driving, and he's getting into it, and all of a sudden he pumps this like 50s tune. He's like, do the mess around, and he's like jamming out, like playing the piano on the dash, and then eventually like he gets his jacket stuck, and that's what leads them to like go into this crazy car accident where they turn into skeletons and stuff, which was an excellent effect.
Before we wrap up, I want to go for this movie for this movie. I can't. Why am I blanking out on it? Tony, what are your final thoughts, and what would you rate this on a 1 to 10?
Well, in general, I could see why people are fans of it if they watched it at an earlier age. I think this is kind of in the same boat as a lot of movies from the 80s and the 90s, where if you watch it when you're young enough and it can hook you in, then you're hooked for life. I will always watch Home Alone when it comes to Christmas time because Home Alone was a movie that I grew up on, or like the Ninja Turtles movies, or the old RoboCop, or any of that kind of stuff. Uh, but if you watch it later on in life, I don't think it's gonna hit any of those same marks, so it just doesn't work the same. Uh, that being said, I'd probably give it like a 6 out of 10. It's not a horrible movie or anything like that. It's, got a couple moments here and there that I'll be remembering fondly or whatever. And a lot of the rest of it's just kind of hit or miss, or you take it or leave it or whatever. It's not something that I would recommend to anybody other than the people that I know love this type of movie.
Okay. And Paden, what were your final thoughts and a score of 1 to 10 on Planes, Trains, and Automobiles?
Again, it's a great example of the time of what could be made when you have a lot of things lining up. John Hughes was a very big name director, and while I don't think he particularly added a lot as far as quality, he did bring a name, which I think helped get this movie the start off recognition that it needed. Then when you throw in guys like John Candy and Steve Martin, who were two of the it guys at the time, I mean, I don't know present day comedians, so I couldn't even think of a good present day example to say it, but those two were the big guys. Steve Martin was a massive comedian at the time with SNL and his stand up, and he even had like a music album at the time. He was huge, and John Candy was just huge.
Maybe Will Ferrell will be one of the more modern equivalents.
I think Will Ferrell. I think that like 10 years ago, Will Ferrell would have been. Yeah. I'm saying like now, I don't know. I don't know who the hell, but that Bo guy that Drew likes, that's probably the guy.
Maybe a couple of years ago, Steve Carell.
Yeah, sure, go with that. Basically take your two it guys and put them together. Imagine like in the mid 90s if you had Jim Carrey and who was the other big comedian at the time?
Robin Williams.
No, the one who was kind of like Jim, Adam Sandler.
Yeah.
Imagine you had Jim Carrey and Adam Sandler pairing together in the mid 90s. How big that would have been. That's essentially what they did there.
And Adam Sandler was John Candy's role because he got fat eventually.
Not a perfect movie, but one I definitely recommend anyone to go and check out. It's a good laugh, even if you're not watching around the Thanksgiving season. I'd never considered a Thanksgiving movie, even though it does involve it somewhat. It's just a comedy to watch any time of the year. I would give it an 8.5.
Very cool. So, with that being said, we're going to finish up our first movie here on the Four Wheel Movie Club, and we're going to move on to our second, which is another Hughes Entertainment production, Dutch. So if you're listening here on the little YouTubes, make sure you click the next link, and you're going to find out what we're going to say about Dutch.